Welcome to our September Buzz Pick of the Month author event. We're thrilled to have Paula Hawkins and Sarah McGrath here to talk about Paula's latest book, A Slow Fire Burning. But first, let's get to know them both even better. Paula Hawkins is the author of the #1 New York Times-bestselling novels, Into the Water and The Girl on the Train. An international #1 bestseller, The Girl on the Train has sold almost 20 million copies worldwide and has been adapted into a major motion picture. Sarah McGrath is Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of Riverhead Books, where she acquires and edits a range of fiction and nonfiction. Among the critically acclaimed, prize-winning, and New York Times bestselling authors she currently works with are Paula Hawkins, Britt Bennett, Elizabeth Gilbert, Lauren Groff, and many others. A Slow Fire Burning is on sale now and available at your local independent bookstore. Visit indiebound.org to find an indie in your area. Throughout the conversation today, feel free to use the Q&A box to send in a question. We'll have a Q&A portion towards the end with some of the questions here and those submitted at your registration. Closed captioning is also available at the bottom of your screen. On behalf of Indie Book Buzz and Bookfinity, thank you so much for joining us today. And remember to follow Indie Book Buzz on Instagram and visit bookfinity.com for all the latest BuzzPick news. And now we're pleased to virtually welcome Sarah McGrath and Paula Hawkins.
Hi, Paula. Nice to see you.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Nice to see you.
As you know, I love this book very, very much. I'll just tell everyone a little bit about it to get it started. It begins on. I mean, I'll let you do it too, but I want to frame it. It begins on a houseboat in London, and at the very start, I'm not spoiling anything, a body is found brutally murdered on the boat. And over the course of the story, you're introduced to 3 different women, other characters too, but 3 women who have some connection to the person who has died. But where I'm going with this is that it is not just a question of who killed Daniel. It is much more than that. It is whoever killed him, why did they kill him, and sort of all the layers in there. But what I was most struck by when I first started working with you on this book is that it's a riveting mystery, and people, I'm sure readers can attest to that. You just flip the pages to figure out what's happening. But there's also so much more going on. I mean, it is a really emotional read. I connected to, there's like a lot of emotional layers there, and also some other things going on that we'll get to. But I thought maybe in order to sort of to talk about some of your themes that have to do with the emotional layers in the book, maybe you want to tell us about sort of how you started the book, or what character you had in mind, and how it developed from there.
Yeah, thanks very much. That I think that's a good place to start. So I always start my novels with a character. That's the way I start thinking about a story. I'm generally thinking about a person that I'm interested in writing about. And in this case, that person was the character of Laura, who's one of the women you mentioned. She's this young woman. She's in her 20s. She's had a difficult time in her life. She had an accident as a child. She was knocked off her bike, and this has left her with some difficulties, physical disabilities, but also some emotional, behavioral problems. She has a condition called disinhibition, which means that she has no filter. She says inappropriate things. She acts impetuously. She loses her temper really quickly. So she gets herself into trouble all the time, basically. She makes bad choices. But she also suffers from the fact that people don't get her. They don't understand her. She's judged really harshly a lot of the time. And so that all of these things just make her life difficult to manage. And those are the kind of characters that I am drawn to. I want to write about people who kind of exist a bit on the margins, whose lives are a bit tricky, but who are in other senses ordinary. They're doing ordinary things, trying to keep down a job, trying to have a relationship, all these things. So Laura finds herself at the beginning of the novel. She has a one-night stand with this man, Daniel. Daniel turns up dead. Laura is, the chief suspect, and she's a terrible person to be a chief suspect, because she can't speak to the police in the way that she ought to in that. So, but that's where it starts. And Laura's story is a very emotional one. She's somebody who's suffered, she's been let down by various people, including members of her family. But that is also true of the other characters in the novel. Daniel's aunt, Carla, again, has had a very, very traumatic loss in her life, and is now separated from her husband as a result, even though they still love each other and they still see each other, and that's very complicated too. And there's another of the main characters involved, a woman called Miriam, who's Daniel's neighbor. Basically, she lives on the houseboat just down the way. Again, has suffered something, is kind of a survivor of something. So they're all kind of struggling to deal with long past traumas and tragedies, and failing to cope with these things in various ways.
Yeah, that's sort of what I was getting at. Each of their individual stories is so powerful and relevant to the story. And one of the things that you really show, I mean, not directly, but it comes out, is how we are shaped by the things that have happened to us in the past, and how, the kind of behavioral explosions that might come later might have not to do with what happened immediately before, or even what happened yesterday, but what happened, at some other point in someone's life. So you really explore damage in that way, in so powerfully. Yeah, and Laura there's that great scene at the beginning where she's calling her father for help. And she's having a kind of an imagined conversation with her stepmother. She's sort of hearing her stepmother's voice in her head, and then she actually hears the stepmother on the phone in the background, and she's so alone. And that's one of the things that you use to great effect. Also, those interviews with the police where you're like, Laura, stop talking, stop saying things.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much her. I hope that she will be the kind of character that people take to heart, because although she can be very frustrating, and she, as I said, she makes bad choices, she is also an endearing character. She has a generosity of spirit about her, and she's kind of plucky in a way. She wants to do the right thing. She wants to get ahead in the world, but she keeps sabotaging herself. But as I say, this is not entirely her fault. So I think that's the thing. She's complicated. She's really complicated, and that's what I find fascinating in all characters, is people who are neither good nor bad, but who are essentially extremely complicated. Because I think generally that's kind of what we are. We all are, even though hopefully our experiences are slightly less extreme than the ones that my characters are going through.
Right. Yeah. Before I get too into the book, can you talk about, this is a very different setting for you, right? I mean, the Into the Water was really set in a remote landscape, and Girl on the Train was set in the suburbs. This is more your London book, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is. So yes, the Girl on the Train is very suburban. Into the Water is very rural. This is a London book, although it's maybe not the London that most people will think of straight away. It's set on and around the Regent's Canal, which is runs all the way through London, sort of across west to east. And my flat in London is just south of the canal, so I know there's a little area in the middle around sort of Clerkenwell and Islington, which I know really well. There's lots of little houseboats there. People live down there. People rent the houseboats. There are also, on either side, there are quite grand Victorian houses that are now worth quite a lot of money. But this was also an area of London that was quite heavily bombed in the war, so you have a lot of new build housing, which would be cheaper, or council housing, social housing. So there's a real jumbled up sort of mix of people living there, rich and poor, cheek by jowl, kind of, rubbing up against each other. So it's a very rich environment. It's very picturesque, and it's also a very rich environment for a novel, for a story like this, where you have all sorts of different people at quite, and all sorts of sort of opportunities for people to clash and to get in each other's way.
As you were talking, I was imagining walking by houseboats on a canal, and the way you can see so much of someone's life on a houseboat, because you're really close, and there's things on the deck, and it's a little bit Girl on the Train is about sort of seeing into people's lives too, right? I mean, this is much closer, but how did you come up with the houseboat idea?
Yeah, I mean, it is clearly a function of my extreme nosiness and my sort of wanting to imagining other people's lives all the time. So it's a thing that I do, and I'm sure lots of writers do it, lots of people do it. That thing of like, oh, I wonder who lives in that house. What are they like? Why would you live there? Blah, blah, blah. Those kind of things. So the houseboats have always fascinated me. There's a kind of, because they look kind of cozy and sweet, but then I imagine actually living on them is probably not that cozy at all. A lot of them are really beautiful and, really beautifully kept and painted with little plants and solar panels and all these things. But every now and again, you will pass one that's kind of sinking a bit into the water, and it's kind of, a bit, the windows are all grimy, so you can't see inside. And it did just strike me that there could be anything inside one of these. You have no idea. It's, there could be human remains, there could be anything inside. So this is the sort of way that my mind works. It goes to those kind of places, like how long could something lie in there before anyone noticed? They're all bolted up, and so that sort of got me started on thinking, this would be a good place to start. So I have the character, as I said, I have Laura, but just a character isn't enough. You have to have somewhere to go with the character, and that's often suggested to me by a location. And in this case, it was that house, that little community around the houseboats. I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do with it, but I knew that there was potential in there. People living close together, the sort of the transience of it too. Not everyone necessarily knows who belongs where at which point. So it's the kind of place where people might be able to go unnoticed.
Yeah, that really struck me. That I mean, it is an interesting demographic, because it is at once sort of charming, but also, I mean, there's no indoor plumbing, and yes, and you have these neighbors where you're right up against them, and also the voyeur is like you and me walking by, looking in on the outside. You're exposed, but yeah, like how well do you know the person next door? But now you have another set of neighbors, different kind of neighbor relationship in the book, and we haven't talked about those characters. But can you tell us a little bit about Irene? I really love Irene.
Yes, right. So Irene is, she's an older lady. She's 80, in fact, and she lives a little way away from the canals, just a few minutes. And she's sort of tangentially connected to this action because her former neighbor was the murdered man's mother. So it's a bit complicated, but it's not too bad.
They live in like townhouses where they share
a little
wall,
right?
a
little row of houses.
Yeah,
a little
so
row
also
of houses.
Close together in a different
very
kind
close
of
together
setting.
Sort of the kind of small old Victorian, like tiny little cottagey houses that you get in the centre of London.
The noise
you
of the
can
person
hear things.
next door.
You can hear people walking around next door. There's no privacy. So Irene lives there, has lived there for ages. She's widowed now, and she's very lonely. The woman who lived next door, Angela, Daniel's mother, has also passed away. So she's a lonely person. She's a great reader, particularly a reader of crime. She has very particular views about the sort of crime that she likes and the sort of crime she approves of. But she's this wonderful. I love her because she's open and she's not done yet. She may be 80, but she's not finished living. She's got plenty she still wants to do. She wants to make friends. She wants to travel. She is, as I said, open to the world. And she is very kind, and also very astute. And people make assumptions about her because she's very elderly and because she's sometimes forgetful. They extrapolate from that she's, losing her marbles, but actually she's very switched on. So she's a really interesting character.
I love her because, in part, I love her because of the way that I felt that she represented me as the reader. She's sort of removed from the action. She's not like, she's in her house. She's just in her house reading all the time, like thinking about writers and books and organizing her books. And, but she's an observer and a listener. And, but anyway, she gives you a great opportunity to weave in these little Easter eggs for readers who can appreciate them about other crime novels, right, that she is reading. They're not part of the plot. They're just like, they're little pleasant finds for us. Did you enjoy doing that?
Yeah, because I guess, so there is a character in the book who's a novelist as well. So we have a reader who's Irene. We actually have a bookseller, Miriam, and we have a novelist. And so one of the things I do talk about a bit in the book is crime writing, and about sort of the ownership of ideas, where your ideas come from, how you formulate those ideas, whether you can steal an idea from someone else. And I was thinking a bit about what I like in a crime novel, what I think is good crime, or just a good novel. And so one of the things I was able to do with Irene was like drop in a few of things that I like. So Irene mentions, I think, Barbara Fine, A Dark Adapted Eye. She mentions Tana French. She mentions Pat Barker, Cormac McCarthy. So there's a bunch of things that you'll see that you can tell that I'm saying approving of these things via Irene. She's also quite dismissive of some sorts of crime, and that's not necessarily me speaking on those points, but she's got very firm views about things, and she particularly dislikes the novel written by the novelist in the book, Theo, which she's not a fan of. But there you go. Yeah, it was an interesting way of me being able to talk a bit about writing and reading and criticism and all those kind of things. And I think, that's quite fun for people who enjoy books about books.
Yeah, yes. So Theo is the writer, and he's a very successful novelist who has sort of dabbled in crime writing, and at the very first page of the book the reader doesn't know it at first, is a passage from Theo's crime novel. And what you realize when you get to the end of it is that it's actually Irene reading Theo's crime novel. And at the end, forget her exact words, but she says like, "Oh, what rubbish," right? She's very dismissive of it. So was that fun to do, to sort of ventriloquism?
It was. You will know as my editor that the book within a book was something I had to work on a lot, because it's actually quite a difficult thing to do. I think to do in a way that's interesting. But that was it was a more playful aspect, I guess, of the novel. And generally, my novels aren't the most playful ones. Well, it's not something I do. So this was quite fun for me to do something, to have a slightly more lighthearted. There were bits of lightheartedness weaving its way through this novel in a way I don't think I achieved, certainly in Into the Water or The Girl on the Train, which they just didn't have that side to them in the same way.
Yeah, no, there's real humor in here. It's not a funny story, but it's
really
funny.
Not funny, but but yeah, I managed to inject more humor into, which was really nice for me, because you can get a bit bleak when you're writing about quite as much tragedy and trauma as I tend to write about.
Yeah, I had a close-up view of your process, but I think I would feel, even if I hadn't had that close-up view of your process, that you enjoyed writing this book.
Oh yeah, I did. There were still times when it was really hard, but it was a more enjoyable process, I think. Certainly than the last one. I think I look back on The Girl on the Train with slightly rose-tinted spectacles now, but it was more fun for me, I think, than Into the Water.
Yeah. Second, not that Into the Water wasn't your second book, but it was your second book after a huge success.
And
that is hard.
It had particular challenges to it.
Yeah. I've watched a lot of writers struggle with that position, and of course they're incredibly grateful to be in that position, but all of a sudden you had been writing for yourself, or maybe like one or two other people, and all of a sudden you feel the weight of millions of readers' expectations, and how can you possibly please them all, because they all want something slightly different, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. So you talked about how you started with the character of Laura. Did you what else? Did you always know that you were going to be exploring these ideas of sort of female rage, or what did you want to do with that?
Yeah, it's weird, because I never think that I think everything comes to me out of character. So I come up with a scenario, and I come up with a bunch of characters, and then I sort of see what comes out of their interactions, and it did seem to be what came out of most of their stories was rage, and a particular sort of very justifiable rage, I think. But I guess I was thinking to some degree about the ways in which female anger is often dismissed or treated as kind of laughable and ridiculous. And these women are angry for, as I said, for very good reasons, and they are trying to find ways to channel that anger. And I think, you know, that, and finding them. So it's not something I set out with. Well, not that I consciously set out with anyway, but it just came out of the kinds of people that I was thinking about and the situations that they found themselves in. Miriam in particular has this real sense of powerlessness because she's middle-aged, she's not attractive, she doesn't have money, she doesn't have a rich husband, she doesn't have anything that gives her kind of social capital. And she's so easily dismissed. And that, I can just get that kind of pure fury that you get from feeling the unfairness of that, you know, you count too, just because you don't have money, just because you're not young and beautiful, you still have value. And she really feels that the lack of that. And so that was something I really wanted to explore about how that can push you to quite an extreme point, that feeling of powerlessness.
Yeah. Yeah, as you were talking about Miriam, I was thinking about your characters represent quite a range of ages, generations, and social class backgrounds, right? I mean, there's like a lot of different demographics, and yet they all have these things that they're dealing with. They all, right? Like nobody has a pristine landscape, emotional landscape.
No, absolutely. I mean, so Miriam and Laura both, I guess, are sort of lower down in terms of powerlessness. They are, well, in terms of having power, they are kind of at the bottom there. Carla, because she has some status, she has wealth, and she's an attractive woman. She's from a relatively wealthy background. But in a way, she has suffered one of the most terrible losses of all. So that kind of means nothing. Well, she feels as though it means nothing to her. Obviously, you know, these things are all relative, and I think we can see from the outside that actually, yeah, your life could be worse. But you know, you're in the situation you're in. But yeah, so there's a very clear sort of divide between someone like Laura, who really struggles from an economic point of view as well. She has to try and keep a job, and she really struggles with that. But someone like Carla, who doesn't really need to work because she's got money, her ex-husband has got money. So despite her struggles, there's still a level of comfort there. So I think that's something that really sort of, I think that's something that became more important to me as I was writing it, like realizing how much more difficult certain situations can make your life. Mm-hmm. Okay, we're all struggling, but there are layers to this, and there are levels of comfort and discomfort that come from other things, from, you know, socioeconomic things.
Sure. And they're all struggling, but they have different access to different tools to help them overcome. Yeah. There's that. I don't think I'm giving anything away. When Laura is held by the police for questioning, for obvious reasons, because she was with him, you know, and he was the last person seen with him, and she doesn't show up for her job at the laundromat as a result, and so, you know, but her boss doesn't understand that, you know, we are like, oh, but it's not fair, it's not her fault. But, you know, her boss is not having it, and she loses her job, and that's a huge thing.
Yeah, and because Laura's life is chaotic, because Laura is always getting into trouble, perhaps not as severe as this, but her boss is like, they've tried to be nice, and there's only so much, you know, sort of grace she can extend. But obviously, from Laura's point of view, this seems like so unfair.
Right.
And it is. And some people's lives are just hard like that.
Yes. You know that I think your title is one of the most brilliant titles ever. I mean, it works just knowing nothing else about the book. It's a great title because it describes the sort of the simmering build of any great, you know, crime read. But it has particular meaning for these characters in this story. Do you want to explain the title?
Yeah, so slow fire refers to the process by which acid in paper starts to, well, it sort of makes it go brittle and break apart and eventually disintegrate. So if you get hold of like some very old books, I always think of those orange Penguin paperbacks for some reason, they often have, you'll find that the edges of the paper are starting to break away. They almost look like they've been burned, and that process is called slow fire. So what is within the paper starts to eat them over a very, very long period of time. And that struck me as like a really great metaphor for what was happening to all the characters in my novel. All of them are carrying something inside, some guilt or shame or self-loathing or a lust for revenge or an anger or what have you, that has the potential to destroy them, that has the potential to eat away at them if it's not, dealt with. So it works very much on that level. Also, it works because this is a book about books, so that was good. So there are lots of ways, and it conveys the sense of how what I was interested in is not the immediate aftermath of trauma, but how years and years and years after something's happened to you, you're still coping with this thing that's inside you that you can't quite deal with. So yeah, it worked. I was very happy to. I read an article about Slow Fire, about the book thing on a literary blog, and I was like, oh yeah, that's perfect.
How fortuitous that the acidification process of paper, wherein it contains the seeds of its own destruction, is called slow fire as opposed to like acidification.
Exactly.
Yeah. So did you always know, without giving anything away, did you always know what happened? Or how did you get there?
I knew who done it and sort of broadly why, but that leaves so much space because, as you say, although there is a whodunit at the heart of the book, it's not the only thing going on, and the why done it is a very big part of it, and various other mysteries kind of adjacent to that. So all of those things, there was so much scope to sort of move things around and shift things around while I was writing it. And I am of the opinion that that's where the best writing happens, when you're in the novel. You know where you're sort of headed, but there's still loads of space for you to figure things out and make all sorts of different connections while you're actually, working with the characters, and you're really in their heads, and in a way that I don't think you can if you just plan everything out from the start. I do think that makes the whole process probably slower and slightly more, I want to say chaotic, but that's not really what I mean. It doesn't run quite so smoothly. I do believe that, but I still think that it's more satisfying for me, and ultimately you end up with a more interesting read as a result. Some people swear by planning everything. I don't feel that that's the best way for me to get to the stuff that really interests me the most. But so there's loads that get figured out. You know that stuff that happened at the end, I only came up with, and there's lots of changes in the last third of the book. There were lots of developments but I could never have planned those from the beginning if I hadn't already written a huge chunk of it, and I didn't know all those characters really well. So for me, that's how it works. It's slow, and it might be slightly torturous at times, but you get there eventually.
Yeah, I suspect, as a writer, it maybe feels less efficient to do it the way that you do it, but maybe more effective. I've actually forgotten lots of parts of the process, but I do remember at some point you figured something out, and when it went back to you, and then you sent back a draft to me, and I remember being struck by the things you had inserted, although they did not feel inserted along the way. That sort of, since I knew where it was going, it's reading a book for the second time, when you, as the reader or editor, where you know what's going to happen, there's like an even deeper appreciation for the little signs that other readers may miss, but they're so powerful. And if just to set that up, I always wonder, if in your revising process, if that's sort of, if you like have a list of them ahead of time, and you're like, I'm gonna put it here and here and here, or they just come in.
I think there is, at some point, there's a list of like things I know I need to deal with, things I know I need, for example, to give the reader a greater indication of this point, for example. And I may not know where that's going to go, but then as you read through, you're like, oh, that's perfect. I can put it here. This fits, So I think there are. I'll always write a list I think that I know that I haven't quite got yet, that I haven't dealt with yet. But yeah, you know, sometimes it takes a while for it to sort of all shake out and fall into place. That's kind of how it feels. You know, I read a piece by, I can't remember who it is. It's another writer, much better writer than me, who was saying that, you know, writing is about nothing works, nothing works, nothing works, and then suddenly everything works. And you kind of can't tell how to get to that point, but it just happens. So, there you go.
Yeah, I sometimes feel that way as an editor. Like I don't feel that nothing's work. I don't mean about you. I just mean in general, where one of my the skills I have to have developed is to see in a project that it will be able to get to that point, right?
Yeah.
That, you know, but it's so great when you have that moment when it comes. It's just, you know, between draft 1 and 2 or 2 and 3 or whatever it is, where something clicks into place and all of a sudden it's so much more itself than it had been previously, you know. It's
That's a
very
really good way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yes, suddenly, as you say, everything sort of seems to click into place, and
yes,
and that seems like magic, because you've been working at it for ages and haven't been able to click it into place, and then suddenly just there it goes.
Yeah, but I can often tell by talking to the writer that it's in their head, right? It's when I can't tell that it's in their head that I get really worried. But you always knew, you know, that you just needed to find all the, you know.
Yeah, I knew that there was something there. You've just got to find it. But yeah, that's the tricky part.
Yeah. All right, I have a list of questions that other people have asked, but I also sorry, there's a bunch of questions that were here that were saved in the Q&A. Let's see, lots of people love your books. Somebody asked, was Miriam's trauma inspired by any true crime in particular?
It kind of was, actually, but it's so far away from what actually happens to Miriam in the book. Is nothing like what happened in the thing I read. I read a news story about a woman who, well, she was a teenager when it happened, and she was walking home from school, and a man tried to get her to get into the car with him, and she was tempted, but then something was off. He said he lived on her road and he was going to give her a lift home, this kind of thing. Something was off, and she said no. And this man turned out to be a serial killer who abducted and murdered another schoolgirl just days after he tried to pick her up. And that story really struck with me. Because I was thinking, what must that have felt like for her to know that she came this close? That's, you know, those kind of silly decisions you might make as a teenage girl. It's raining, you're cold. He seems like a nice guy, you know you shouldn't, but you might do. Anyway, so that's kind of where it started, and then it changed radically from that, because actually what happens to Miriam is far worse, and she does get blah blah. But that's where it started. So it came out of that wondering, like, what it must have felt like for that girl to realize just how close she'd come to disaster, to something really terrible.
Yeah. Miriam, of course, has sort of multiple traumas.
She does.
but there's one that's
but I think what interested me was not just, okay, you would feel like relief, but you might also feel guilt.
Yeah.
Kind of survivor's guilt over that. And that's kind of that's really the thing that Miriam has, is the kind of terrible survivor's guilt.
Yes. And it makes her, go ahead.
Yeah, it makes her behave, it makes her sort of feel more badly about herself than she ought to. She shouldn't feel bad about what happened to her. It wasn't her fault. But I think sometimes survivor's guilt does that to you. It just distorts your sense of whether you were a good person or not. And she's come to sort of believe that she's actually not a good person.
Exactly. That's what I was thinking. She has this pressure on herself that I'm not sure every other person feels all the time, to constantly sort of define what kind of person she is. And Laura actually too is sort of trying to establish or prove, you know, what kind of person she is compared to the person she used to be before her accident.
There's that, but also that she always feels like she's being judged as a certain way, and she's trying to prove that I'm not that. That's just what you know. It's not my fault. I didn't mean that. I'm this, really.
Yeah.
But yeah.
let's see. Hold on. Lots of appreciation for your characters and your books. Okay, I have some submitted questions, and I'm going to let's see. Melissa says, some of your characters are very deeply flawed and troubled. Is it hard to write in that headspace?
Yeah, I mean, some of them are more difficult than others, certainly. And I think a big part of how difficult they are is whether you have hope for them. So whether you feel that they can get better or that there is some light at the end of the tunnel for them. I think with those characters where I feel, or I know, because I know what I'm going to do to them, that they're doomed or what have you, then that's harder. And yeah, some things are very hard to write about. There are some things that happen, thing that happened to Carla that is awful to write about. So yeah, it does. I'm also quite good, I must say, though, at putting it aside. When I'm done with it, I read something else or watch something on TV and think about something different. So I don't sit there feeling awful about it all the time. But yeah, there are times when I think about, there are times when I sort of question myself, does this need to be this bleak? Does this need to be this horrible? Does this person really need to be like this? But then you're following a kind of logic of like, well, if this happened to her, this is probably, this is how I believe she would end up. So yeah, you've got to kind of follow the kind of internal logic of the world you're writing. But it can be bleak. But as I say, it's why maybe it was nice for me to write people like Irene and Theo, although he's not a happy character, he's vaguely ridiculous, so that was quite funny. I've managed to balance it out with a bit more light this time, I think.
I was going to say, I mean, it is true that many, not all of the characters have, are suffering from trauma or whatever. It doesn't feel like a bleak read, though. I think, I mean, you're moved. I felt moved by, angry on behalf of some characters, not at them, but on their behalf, and sad for others, and almost like fearful. But I didn't feel depressed reading the book. I mean, it's you're I think because there's the adrenaline. I mean, it's hard to feel depressed with adrenaline. And also just there's a certain energy that comes from your humor and just sort of the readerly satisfaction that comes from your like cleverness. So I just want to be clear. It's like it is dealing with some dark stuff, but it's not a, I don't know. It won't leave you lying on the floor crying your eyes out.
Good.
Although there is one place that made me cry, though, in a good way. But
good.
Oops, sorry. Wait, that's the wrong. Okay. This is an interesting question from Berta. In which other genres, if any, have you considered writing? You kind of already have done.
Well, yes. So before I wrote The Girl on the Train, I did write 4 romantic comedies under a pseudonym, Amy Silver. And those came about in a slightly strange way because the first one was actually commissioned, and I was given an idea, like a character and an arc, and told to go and do this. So that was a bit odd and didn't really feel like mine. I had a weird sort of distance to it. And then the publishers asked me to do another one, and I carried on in that vein, making up the stories myself after that and coming up with characters. I never felt very comfortable in that genre, in romantic comedy. I'm not a great romantic, and I'm, well, not terribly funny. So it wasn't really my thing. In any case, the stories, they just kept getting darker and darker. I wanted to introduce more and more tragedy into the stories, which is not really what the brief had been. So it was clear that wasn't really right for me. As to going elsewhere, I mean, clearly there is something about my sensibility and the way I think about the world that fits with noir suspense thrillers very well. I would never say never. I can't see myself probably writing something like sci-fi just because I don't really read very much of it, and I don't maybe have that brain for that sort of writing. But yeah, I'd never say never. But this just feels a very natural fit to me. So I'd have to discover something particular that would make me want to go in a different direction, I think.
Yeah. I should say that you're a very good reader. You read a lot, and you across many different styles.
I do, but I don't tend to read a lot of other sort of genre fiction, I guess. I read literary fiction. I mean, this is a difficult thing to say, but I mean, to quantify. But yeah, I read lots of different kinds of stuff. I just, when I start thinking about character and story, I seem to go down the suspense route. And, you know, I was talking to Megan Abbott about this, that she was like, well, why would you write anything else? You know, crime is so great because it's, you know, blood on the carpet, back to the wall, you've got this dramatic storyline, you've got all the conflict. It's, you know, it's what every writer wants, and it's just there for you.
Yes. And also, once you get to the status that you have, you can kind of do whatever you want with it. If you want to write a book within a book, you can do that, you know. Leanne asks, what are your favorite and least favorite parts of the writing process?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think the beginning is always probably the most fun, when you're thinking about your characters and what you're going to do with them, where you're going to go with them, and this basically can go anywhere. There's all these possibilities that are open to you, and as you start writing, those kind of the avenues that you could follow are starting to narrow and narrow, and things become more difficult. And I think there's always a point where you're in the middle somewhere where you're like, oh, okay, this does not work, I'm stuck. And that's always terrible, because there's always a moment of panic where you think, I can't get out of here, I'm stuck. And usually you can actually get out of here, you just have to think about it in a different way. But I think, so I think there's that wonderful bit at the beginning where anything is possible. But anyway, when you've got a great idea and you're like, aha, this is the most brilliant idea anyone has ever had. So that's always really nice. But yes, and I then think it gets harder and harder, and I think endings are incredibly difficult to make. Endings feel satisfying, but at the same time surprising and not crazy melodramatic. And so, I mean, that's always very difficult. When you actually get it to work, that's a wonderful feeling. When it all, as we were talking about, that thing where it all clicks into place and you're like, aha, brilliant. That's also nice.
Now, I is my own question, but how do you feel once it's complete? So, you know, you're not working on it anymore, it's going to copy editing or whatever. Is that a period of peace, or is that a period of excitement, or is that a sort of dread that you're going to have to, you know, hear what everybody thinks of it? Or I see different reactions in different people.
I find it quite anxiety inducing. I think that, like, I can't change anything now, it's gone. Well, I mean, you can always change, you can't change tiny things, but, you know, basically it's done. So if you now suddenly think of something that you need to change, it's too late. So that's slightly frightening. Waiting for responses from people is obviously frightening. That, you know, when it's being sent out and galleys or whatever are being sent out, and you're just, there's that moment of, you know, and you know, usually, well, generally this time it's been a really nice experience because the response came back and it was very warm and enthusiastic, and so that was great. But yeah, for me it's mostly anxiety, unfortunately.
I've been trying to crack this and I haven't figured it out, but especially if you're a newer writer, there's this period, it's almost like a universal panic that authors go through. It's like the galleys exist, so you can't change anything, and they're in the world, so you feel exposed, and they're going out. It's an incredibly slow process, incredibly slow. I mean, I don't know if people realize, but like from copy editing to the book coming out, it's like a year, maybe 10 months. And so if you're a person who needs a lot of like positive feedback to feel at ease, it's a very long time to feel like uncertain. And
yeah, I think in that early bit, you've got to, I think in the early part, I can just put it out of my head, but it's when you know that actually people have got it in their hands now, they are going to be reading. That's really scary.
But for books that we're publishing, I mean, almost everything I publish, it's all about the read, right? You have to give people time to read it. It's like you can't sort of, they're not going to come back and give you a response based on like just the topic or something, right? Like you want them to read it properly, and that takes a while, and you don't want to rush it. But yeah,
I mean, you really don't. I think you really don't want to rush it, because I think I can tell sometimes when you read reviews, you can tell that somebody rushed the book. that they had too many books that they needed to get through, and they didn't read this. And that's not what you want. As obviously, if you've been working on it for 3 years, you'd like somebody to actually read it properly and at least try to engage with the material. So yeah, you definitely don't want it rushed.
Yeah. Okay. Of all the characters, this is from Brittany, of all the characters you've written, which one has stayed with you the most or still haunts you? That's a hard question.
I mean, there's a way in which I guess Rachel is the one that she's the Rachel from The Girl on the Train is the character I talk about the most. She's so in a way, she's the one I think I probably thought about the most of any of my characters. Mm-hmm. But in terms of like the ones that sort of haunt me, it's probably somebody more minor. There were lots of characters in Into the Water, and someone like Sean, who had a very, very sad story. Sometimes I would like to return to him, his wife even, they were so messed up, those people. I do, that book was filled with a lot of very sad people. I mean, I hope that the characters I've just written will stay with me a little bit. But I think, Rachel is probably the one I think about the most, just because I talk about her the most. She's the one that other people talk about the most. Yeah, Rachel from On the Train.
Well, and also she lives on screen, which brings me to another question, which is Diane asks, how involved do you get with the film versions of your books? But I also would expand that and sort of say, like, do your feelings about the book change when you see it on screen, or how do you think of it? Do you think of the film version, or is the book version sort of forever in your head?
The book version is very definitely primary in my head, because I'm very aware of the fact that the film version is just one version. It's just an interpretation. I think that's the thing people have to remember, particularly when people don't like a version of something. And I know lots of people had objections to The Girl on the Train, but it's only one interpretation. It's not the interpretation. Some things get remade lots of times. Think about the Christie. There's millions of versions of it. I wasn't involved in the making of The Girl on the Train. I didn't have anything to do with the writing. I did only the fun things. I visited sets. I went to the premieres. So I did only the fun stuff. And I think that was absolutely right for me at the time. It's very time consuming to write for the screen. I wasn't prepared to do it then. I don't think I would want to do it now. I'm not sure I'd ever want to adapt my own work. I might like to write to screen, but I don't think I'd like to adapt my own book. So I do think I'm one of those people who's happy to go, look, okay, here, you take the material, you do something with it. I mean, obviously, I did speak to the director and the producers, and I knew that we were kind of on the same page, and I okayed the thing about moving it to the States. I was okay with it. But I do think either you retain complete control or you relinquish control. You can't want to interfere in things in the middle. I was basically very happy with that movie. I know, some people didn't like it. I did. I thought there were lots of things about it that were brilliant. So I was quite happy with it.
Nick Hornby has said that he writes a lot of screenplays and he writes a lot of novels, but he doesn't want to do the screenplay for his novel because he doesn't want to work on that story anymore. He's just spent a long time on that one. He wants to do something else.
Also, I think it's maybe harder to cut stuff out of your own novel because you put everything in there for a reason. I mean, it's difficult. I know there are people who do it. Gillian Flynn did it very well with Gone Girl. Yeah, I think it's probably much easier to approach somebody else's work with a fresh eye. And of course, as you just said, you're kind of done with it by the time you finish writing it. Well, I am, definitely. I don't want to really go back and have to rework stuff that I spent 3 years getting right.
Yeah, I can understand that. Well, you maybe already answered this a little bit, but are there any authors that you want to share that you read personally for pleasure? We got your Easter egg authors from the book.
I mean, there are so many. Kate Atkinson, Pat Barker, Cormac McCarthy, Megan Abbott, who I mentioned recently, is somebody whose books I really like. Laura Lippman, Attica Locke, Evie Wild, Shirley Jackson. I've been rereading Le Carré lately, John Le Carré. I've been really loving those. I could literally sit here for an hour and reel off a practice I really like. So if anyone ever wants a list, I'll write a list. I like recommending books to people. So if you ever want to ask me, hit me up for book recommendations.
Somebody asked how you decided to change your name from the pen name to your real name. I think, I'll let you.
Yeah, so well, the pen name was just because that book didn't really feel like it was mine. And then when I wrote The Girl on the Train, I did have a discussion with my agent about whether I should use a different pen name for right. And then and I blame my agent for this. She once said she didn't think that my name was a very good name for an author. So anyway, we did try and think of that, and then we just thought, no, this is weird. Why are we trying to come up with yet another different name? I'll just use my name. My name is.
Then you'd have to be on the screen pretending that your name was something
else.
That's
the other thing. It's a bit weird when you do publicity to have a different. And I mean, loads of people do actually do that, don't they? Because some people write various different sorts of books under different names, but it's a bit weird.
Yeah. Now, was it? I mean, you went from publishing novels under a pseudonym that were not necessarily sort of your idea or what you wanted to write, to publishing the single most successful book in a year that was, on the bestseller list for 100 weeks and in the US, like #1 for 40 weeks or something. Was that how did you handle that?
I mean, it sounds crazy now. I think at the time, you're just kind of living day to day, so you don't sort of take it all in. Now, when you say it was #1 for 40 weeks, I didn't even remember that. That's an insane number of weeks,
isn't it? Yeah. No, I mean,
I don't. I think part of it is that I didn't really have anything to compare it with. Well, I had complete not doing, my books not selling at all, but I didn't know really what was a bestseller or what was a huge bestseller or what was a mega best. I didn't have kind of context for it. I think probably you in publishing my publishers are probably more like than I was, because you did have context. You had all the context. So, but for me, I was just sort of living day to day. Obviously, I toured loads that year after The Girl on the Train came out. I think I came to the States probably 3 times. I did loads in the UK and in Europe, and I went to Australia, and it was all, so I barely had time to breathe, let alone sort of process everything.
Yeah.
And even looking back on it, it seems like just kind of weird. It was wonderful. It was great. It was wonderful. It was really fun. It was also quite scary.
And in this book, you've just sat in your apartment in your house and looked at a screen.
I know. And I do keep talking about this, because I think I did start. I was by the end of all the touring for The Girl on the Train, which I did kind of moan a lot about having to travel, and now I was killed to travel. So, never happy. But yeah, it's weird, and I hope that next year, fingers crossed, will be allowed. I mean, here in the UK, we're starting to do in-person events. I've done a few things with real people, and hopefully next year a little bit more of that. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Well, for the sake of the independent bookstores, whom we all love so much, we
hope
that returns as well.
Absolutely. It would be really nice to come and visit some bookstores. It's been a long time.
I think I've asked all the questions. Let me just check the Q&A one more time. Someone asked, whose writing do you abhor? I'm not going to make you answer that in front of a large audience. Yeah. Is there anything? I think we've pretty much covered it all.
I think we have. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was fun to remember the process a little bit. As I alluded to earlier, it takes so long for a book to go from sort of finished to actually in the world, that I last read this book a long time ago, but it has stuck with me, of course.
Yeah, it is very strange, and it's amazing how quickly you sort of move on to the next thing, and you don't have time to just sit and think. So there is that weird process that you go through after you've written a book, of having to think about how you're going to talk about it. seems like a very
Yes.
weird, like after you finish writing the book, you have to think, now what is my book about?
Yes.
It's like a really weird thing to do, but actually you have to do that.
Yeah, it's funny to see some authors sort of go into it and they're like, this is what my book's going to be about, and then they write it, right? But a lot of them, you know, when the publisher, you know, drafts the catalog copy, the flap copy, whatever, and sends it to the author, of course, talk about it. And I have had numerous authors say to me, that's what my book's about, you know. Sort of.
It's true. You start with your, you know, a lot of the time you're starting with you've got your characters, you've got your plot, but you aren't thinking on overarching grand themes. I don't, you know, so
yeah, well, it's
that
also
has to
very
be pointed
hard.
out to you.
It's hard to boil it down. Any complex story, it's very hard to boil it down to a few lines of copy. And of course, also most complicated books, there are infinite ways you could talk about it, right? So you have
precisely. And I do think one of the things that frustrates me about my novels is that I can't talk about so much of them without giving away spoilers. I would love to be able to just like do a complete spoiler-filled talk, because I think actually then we could really get into stuff, but maybe that'll have to wait for a year or so till more people read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, it was really fun to do this with you, Paula.
It's so nice to talk to you, Sarah.
I'll have to do it again sometime.
Thank you to everyone who I can't see, but thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.